Okay, welcome to another episode of the Rest and Recovery Podcast. Today, going to look at rest and recovery from a slightly different view. Obviously, a key component to rest and recovery is managing stress. And one of the key contributors to stress in pretty much anyone's life is financial stress. It's one of the key contributors to a lot of divorces, whether it be family or even business related, right? So today, I'm blessed to be joined by Dylan Bain, a gentleman that I've gotten to know and is an expert in the field, has his own podcast, Fiscally Savage, financial coach, as well as a professional in the space for many years and one of the top in his field. So, Dylan, thanks for joining me here.
It's absolutely my pleasure to join you.
So, to give backstory, Dylan and I are a little bit not a little bit, but we're in the same mastermind group called the Iron Council, led by Ryan Mickler. And we were at an event, I guess, close to 2 months ago now. And Dylan had the opportunity to speak there and spoke on financial management and the impacts and spoke on a number of awesome points that resonated with me. And I thought pretty much immediately the audience had to hear some of the things that you personally went through and some of the things that you help equip individuals and families with. So by way of that, let me let you introduce yourself more than me introduce you, and just give a little background on your kind of Genesis 1-1 story, as I call
it. So like you mentioned, I'm a corporate CPA in my full-time 9 to 5. And then I also have Fiscally Savage, my financial coaching practice and podcast. I started on my journey towards financial sovereignty back in 2015 when I quit an 8-year career as a math teacher. What had happened is my principal had called me in to her office and told me that I needed to commit fraud for the school. And I told her absolutely not. And she then reminded me that, contracts for next year hadn't come out. Maybe I should go home and spend the night with my daughter and think about what the right thing to do here would be.
Wow.
And so I did that. And that really became the genesis point, because it was at that point I went from how can I continue to be a good teacher to how can I grow and be expansive in my own life. And so I went back the next day and I told my principal that she could place that suggestion someplace uncomfortable. And when she told me that, I was making really bad decisions, I invited her to do something physically impossible. And that was basically the end of my teaching career. And so that kicked off what then became an odyssey going back to school to get my CPA, working my way into one of the largest accounting firms and creating a successful career for myself, basically out of nothing, despite my age at that time, despite everything that was in all the barriers in my way. And at the time I had a wife and 2 kids. So it wasn't like it was just like I could sleep on somebody's couch during this time. Like I had to keep those wheels on that cart going at the same time.
Right.
And, when the smoke started to clear, I was left with not only a good career, a house with a yard. My wife had been able to advance her career at the same time. But I also found that there were a lot of men who went, how did you do that? How did you manage to completely reinvent yourself over the course of 5 years? And after 7 years, have gone from a negative net worth to a very decent and respectable positive net worth. And Fiscally Savage came out of that. Okay. And out of those questions of people coming to me and saying, I wish I could do what you did. And me saying, well, brother, you can.
Yeah, that incredible story. And I'm a little floored, but that you even got approached in that manner. But I think your response was relatively appropriate from an integrity standpoint and a character standpoint. So, and I appreciate the fact that you stood your ground in that regard. But that did lead to some challenges. I know I heard a little bit more detail in the event. And how did you work through that? Right? You mentioned it's not like you're a solo guy on your own and can just grab someone's couch. You had other personal responsibilities to navigate through, and that I think is a hang up for a lot of individuals, a lot of guys and gals who want that pivot but can't figure out how to navigate that. What was a key takeaway, maybe or two, for you to kind of navigate through those uncharted seas, I'll call it?
So the question I would ask for a lot of people who are in a situation where they realize that life is not serving them the way that they wish it did.
Yeah.
And they're looking at ways out, and they say, well, that's a pretty big hill to climb. So for me at the time, when my principal called me in, teaching salary was not paying the bills. So like, I was in a place that teacher salaries were very low, even compared to other teacher salaries. And, as a result, I had additional jobs. So I was working full time. I had all the extras. I, coached, I did test prep. I had an extra class. I did summer school. And I still couldn't afford rent and food and car insurance. So I had 2 additional jobs. So like my principal knew that. She knew that we weren't making ends meet. She knew that I was on welfare. And, so she really used that as leverage against me. And when she, basically put it on my daughter to say, well, think about what the right thing to do here is. What really occurred to me in that moment was there's got to be something more in life. Like, I don't want to be in this situation anymore. I want to be more present for my daughter. I want to be able to create for her a future. And so this was the first time in my life that I had this expansive vision for my life. It was the house with a yard with my kids playing in the back of it, grilling steaks on a grill, while my wife comes up and gives me this hug and tells me, I love what we built. And it was like, it became this thing that I allowed to possess me. And so when it was, hey, let's go back to school. Hey, if you go back to school, you're going to be 2.5 years doing 6 a.m. to 11 p.m., 6 days a week. And all I could think was, yes, please, because I wanted that house. I wanted that yard. I wanted those steaks in the grill. I could smell them. And that really led to the fuel that drove me through, because I didn't know exactly what the other side of the hill was going to look like.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
All I knew was that where I was killing me.
Yeah.
And that was, and it was going to kill my daughter. It was going to kill my wife. And so I was willing to put out the effort, and I really dedicated myself to excellence, because I wasn't entirely certain that public accounting was what I wanted, but I was willing to say, if I start being excellent in all things, then even if I pivot, the pivot's going to be easier because I have a record of excellence.
Right. Yeah. I always think about this, the how matters more than the what. Uh, because at the end of the day, to your point on driving towards excellence, like excellence is portable. It doesn't matter the context or anything like that. It's just going to produce the same fruit. And I appreciate that mindset shift on that. Let me ask you this: how did you get to that tactically, from going from that vision? Because I think maybe others listening, can get caught up in the vision, and it turns into almost the fantasy of it, and then that gap between the present day and the vision, right? And we can get frustrated or disillusioned and lose track of the fact that you're making that progress towards that vision. What was maybe something that kept you in line?
100%. I mean, there's so many things that are part of that, because the idea of being the step from where I was to where that vision was insurmountable.
Yeah.
But the question that I had for myself was, okay, what do I have to get to get that house? What is that? Okay, well, at my age at that point, I was 34. So I'm making a big change, and I thought to myself, okay, so how do I get that to grow my income from where it is to where it needs to be? I got to be the guy who's in the room where it happens. Right? I got to be a decision maker. I have to be value add on an extreme level. Okay, what's the shortest way to go from where I am now to that? And so I actually went and started asking anybody who was in a position what the fastest way to get there. And a lot of them said, well, we always have our auditors in the room. And I was like, oh, okay. How long does it take to be an auditor in the room? 3 years once you get in. Cool. How do I do that? Well, you got to be a CPA. Okay. How do I get a CPA? Well, you're going to have to take all these classes and pass the exam. Excellent. I can do that. So that gave me my very first step, was like, okay, get into an accounting class. Like, that was it. And so it was like, I'm going to get in this accounting class. And now my first step is to be the best student in this accounting class. Nothing else matters beyond this. I'm just going to be the best student. I'm going to ask all the questions. I don't care how many eye rolls I get. I'm going to be at all the office hours, and I'm going to make a reputation as I'm the best student here. And so by the end of that semester with that very first accounting class, I actually had that reputation. This guy's on fire. This guy is amazing. So when I showed up to the second accounting class, the professor who I had never met knew my name. And so what was the test? Now in that second class, I'm going to be the best. And that's how I daisy chained it up.
Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of put a finer point on this, because of that excellence, it was like, okay, now I need to learn how to interview. I need to learn how to network. So I just started saying yes to everything, showing up to every single event that they offered, even if it wasn't for accounting. I went to insurance mixers. I applied to be a nurse. I did all of these things to get as many reps and as much practice to be excellent.
Yes.
If
Awesome.
you just permit me a second more, I did a mock interview with a financial firm, and when I finished, they told me they wouldn't hire me, because my interview was so bad. I thought I had nailed it, but it wasn't good. I re-interviewed on a mock basis, so it was mock practice interviews
Yeah.
7 additional times after that. And when I graduated, they made me a job offer cold. I didn't apply. So like that dedication to excellence really unlocked a lot of doors.
It's amazing that the straightforwardness that just doing it, right? We can overthink things and ponder too long, but it sounds like, and not to oversimplify, you decided this is the manner in which I'm going to operate. This is going to be my human operating system going forward in come heck or high water.
Well, I was changing out the stress of poverty for the stress of achievement. Like that was the major difference, that I wanted to be the person. If I was going to be under as much stress as I wanted to choose the stress. I wanted the stress to be, being excellent. I wanted the stress of, managing skills versus the stress of, can I afford rent this month? The stress of, I'm skipping meals so that my wife can eat.
Yeah.
So it was a choose your hard situation.
Yeah. Well, that's a great perspective. I really, really appreciate that because at the end of the day, stress is unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
Two types of stresses, right, that they consider categorically: eustress and distress, right? Eustress is supposed to be the good, distress is obviously not the good, but how we receive it really and decide to use it is a key contributing factor on how it impacts us mentally, physically, emotionally. Um, so let's talk on that and financial stresses, right? And how do you pivot from that moment of deciding poverty stress versus the achievement stress, and what is it that you see most common when it comes to individuals working through the fiscal aspect of it? Fiscal.
Yeah. So really it comes down to, so one of the things that I've said, and you were there at the talk I gave up in Maine, um, money is emotional.
Mm,
So when we're dealing with somebody's financial stories and then their fiscal realities, it's a story that they're telling themselves that they're bringing into reality. And so when we look at that story, we have to let them tell the whole story and where it came from and where it started. And we're going to have to start asking ourselves, what does that story give you? Because there's a payoff to it.
right.
Somewhere in, even when you have people who are like, I just don't know where my money goes, there's a payoff. They get something out of that. And let me, for the listeners who are saying, well, but who wants to end every month without any money?
Right.
I can give you one from my own. I was a hero because at the end of every month, I heroically fought poverty and kept the wolves from the door for the next 30 days. I was a hero to my wife and my kids in my own mind. but I was. And so part of the payoff of scarcity, part of the payoff of poverty was this false sense of nobility that I'm fighting this good fight.
Right.
That's a payoff, and that's part of that story. And it doesn't make logical sense. It makes emotional sense though. And so looking at people's emotional stories around money is the single most important thing that people have to do in order to move their money stories in a direction that serves them.
It's so on point because you hear finances, you hear, I worked a little bit in the financial industry and stocks and stuff. And, you get the disclaimers and talk about don't make emotional decisions. And and all this. And then you look at the market even a lot of times and the fluctuations within the market. And so much of it is really emotionally driven at more of a macro perspective. Um, what are some skills to help rein that emotional drive in to get, I guess, like Jocko says, is detach from that when it's so intricately emotional?
So much love to Mr. Jocko. But when it comes to your finances, the issue is you need to attach and understand that attachment. There is 0% chance you're going to detach your emotions from your money. Like, I'm an accountant. I'm, people hire me to be the unemotional one in the room when it comes to large corporate financial decisions. And I will promise you that even the most logical CEO is emotionally connected to every single financial decision they make. Like, and I've watched it. I've watched them look me in the eye and tell me, well, logically, and they're, as they explain to me, an emotional decision. So, like, let's just dispense of this idea that somehow money's not going to be emotional. It is 100% of the time. Now, once we do that, what are the emotions? Where do they come from? And how do I manage them? That's
Mm-hmm.
a different question. And then I'll give you an example, of where there's, these types of emotions that are attached to it. Purchasing. And I told the story up in Maine of when I transitioned out of public accounting into industry, I needed a new pair of shoes. And it was like next to impossible for me to buy. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I couldn't actually click the button.
Oh
And
wow.
so people would say, like, well, hold on, and Dylan, just detach yourself from the shoes. Like, it's, you budget it, you have it in the bank, you can buy the shoes. Well, there's an emotional story that's running in the background. And detaching from myself means that I would buy the shoes, but my emotional side's going to continue to punish me for it. So instead, it's looking back at my story and realizing, oh, when I was 16 years old, I got one pair of shoes to go to school, train wrestling, work on construction crews, and work on a horse farm. One pair. And it was the cheap white New Balance Reebok shoes that I shouldn't have been wearing. I needed a pair of work boots, but I wasn't allowed to have them. And so those shoes then rotted off my feet. And when my dad came home and was like, "Oh my God, what's that smell?" and threw them away, my mom lost her shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, so sorry about that.
We can figure that out if we have to.
So my mom lost her mind and told me I was irresponsible and really punished me. So now here I am, 20 years later, trying to buy a pair of shoes and I can't do it. And and this is where the detachment's not healthy. If I
Yeah.
go ahead and buy it, my emotions are still there. They're still going to freak out. So instead, I have to sit with those emotions and heal that wound so that I can buy the shoes and enjoy them. And I can live with the emotions of enjoyment rather than the emotions of fear.
That's dude, that's no pun intended money. I mean, a statement really that reasoning or great explanation on why you need to be attached to it to work through it, not around it in the
Mm-hmm.
in that type of circumstance because of the mental and emotional burden that is tethered to it that goes back so far that in your case and I'm sure others have similar scenarios that you take certain financial choices based on these misappropriations of emotion tied to that thing, whatever that negative narrative is, around it. That, you know, again, not to blame our parents because things come from where they were wrestling with their own things, but why there might be those limiting beliefs on certain things, and we don't buy this or that type of conversation or mindset.
Well, and I'm glad that you brought up, judgment is not a way out,
Right.
right? Judgment digs you a hole. It doesn't dig you a path. And, when you talked about the parents, like, one of the things that I learned later, and this was much later after my grandfather had passed away, I was sitting with all of my aunts and uncles, right? And they're telling their stories of their childhood. And they all talked about shoes as
Mm.
being this constant source of stress in their family when they grew up with poverty. And so the wheels are clicking in my head. It's like, oh, hold on a second. This is actually a generational trauma that
Yeah.
my mother was playing out with me. And, I'm not responsible as for what happened to me as a child. But I am responsible for how I respond to it now. And if nothing else, I need to make sure that it doesn't continue into my children. And that can be really hard because there's a lot of people who say, well, my parents were great parents. Yeah, I bet you they were. And no one comes out of this without some dents and scratches.
Yeah.
I mean, and ultimately, every single one of us, if we were a car, our logic brain is in the passenger seat trying desperately to navigate, while the madman of our emotions is in the driver's seat having a great time.
Yeah.
And so, like, you can't reason with that. You can't think your way out of it. You have to feel your way through it.
That's great. Especially the example, ironically, is I have a teenage daughter who's just got her license. So I was that person on the side trying to control the car when she's driving. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think too, even with our mastermind, we're covering the topic of forgiveness and the corollary aspect of that piece of just reframing one's intent, right? Our parents, none of them had ill will towards us, but they were working through their own thing and unfortunately passed on some of these generational curses or however you want to articulate them. So I honor you for really acknowledging that, but in a healthy way and being able to break free of that and then give your kids a new timestamp, basically a reset or a restart.
100%. And it's part of the work, right? And when you want, like, if you want to find where the bodies are buried, start trying to budget. Because if everyone's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We start out with your physiological needs, and then safety, security, relationships, esteem, self-actualization. Money is the dirt we built that pyramid on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like food, money, and sex, like those three things you will find immediately where there's a lot of wounds that need to be healed. And of the three, people are less likely to talk about money than the other two. So, and I've seen that in coaching practices a lot, where, like, I'm working with a couple and they will talk to me about food, they'll talk to me about their love life, but when it gets to, like, it's all avoidant because they're trying to avoid talking about money.
Wow,
It's crazy.
that's nuts. Uh, yeah, I guess I've heard this too. Is like to your point on watch where the money goes, and you can see you know the truth of the matter, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. Um, Seeing where the ins and outs come from really is a hat tip to kind of what's underneath, um, kind of that iceberg effect.
Yeah, one thing, I love that you brought that up. One of the things that people struggle with is the idea that their time is money. Like, we've heard that,
Yeah.
but it's quite literally true. Because what you do to get your money is you take pieces of your most precious non-renewable resource, your time, and you exchange it for the money. And
Mm-hmm.
it really doesn't matter what you do. And so when you're looking at your money, when you're looking at your bank balance, that represents stored time, stored power, stored energy. And so then how you spend it is really how you spent your time. So if you want to know what type of man you are, look at your checkbook and look at your calendar, because they're measuring the same thing. And you'll know what type of man you are. You'll know what your values are. And, when clients first come into the practice, that's one of the exercises we do, is to sit down and look at all of their spending and then ask the question, what does this spending say about us? If you looked at the spending, tell me about your values. Tell me about the story of your life right now. Tell me how you love your wife and how you love your kids with this. And that is a very sobering experience, and people get very defensive. And my job as a coach is to hold a non-judgmental space for them so that they can start working their way through that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reflecting half a minute here, and it's like, yeah, it's definitely I can understand why you get defensive because deep down I acknowledge some of the things that I'm doing fiscally is not optimal or appropriate, but truly addressing those things head on is certainly a hurdle.
Well, and there's seasons to it too, right? And, like, a great example from my life, especially when I was going back to school and managing, my school and my family and everything else that was going on. You know, that's a lot. That's a lot to handle. And so when I was budgeting, I look at my budget, like I spent a lot of money at Chick-fil-A. And I always thought to myself, like, no, like part of my values is to be healthy and to make a lot of my food at home. Why am I doing this? No shade against Chick-fil-A.
Right.
This is about Dylan, not about the restaurant. And what I came to understand was when I was feeling stressed, I would go and eat a chicken sandwich because that chicken sandwich shut the voice in my head up.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was going to continue to walk through all of the stuff that I was doing, I needed that. And out of all of the different ways to find, some numbing activity, that was probably the least destructive. And so for that season of my life, it was like, okay, a budget line item for Chick-fil-A to help me just deal with the day-to-day stuff, and a budget line item for Rockstar because 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. 6 days a week is hard.
Yeah.
That's just the season of life I'm in. And that doesn't necessarily reflect the values I ultimately want for myself, but they reflect the values I have to have right now. And what changed is that as I moved out, got into public accounting, that Chick-fil-A line item dropped off. And as I moved out of public accounting, because public accounting is a really hard, long hour job too, the Rockstar dropped off. And I was literally having the conversation with my wife last night about how far I've come in not using caffeine. I mean, I have 1 cup of coffee in the morning now
That's
versus
awesome.
what I used to drink.
And most of society.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
so can you unpack that a little further on how you framed it up? Because I really like what you did, the exercises. Like too often, and at least for me, I'll look at the thing and then beat myself up for it, but then also still kind of do it. Where in
Mm-hmm.
this case, you reframed it and be like, okay, not that it's a guilty pleasure, but this might be a binky, right? For
Yeah.
a moment, right? An emotional binky to get through, but you acknowledged it and be like, okay, this is a hall pass for the moment. This is kind of a satisfier, but there's an out clause. There's an exit strategy to that moment because of the season you're in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really being honest with myself as to what am I doing and what am I getting out of it, right? And you can see that, like, one of the things I tell, well, I got a lot of clients come in and say, well, I'm bad at money. Well, are
Right.
you bad at money, or are you addicted to scarcity?
Mm,
Right? And have you put an end date on your scarcity?
wow.
So like if you go back, if you're looking at your life and you're saying, well, really wish that I could improve it, and I think I'm just going to throw something out there, decided that you wanted to be a nurse practitioner, but I got to go back to school. Well, okay, taking on debt is going to be part of that. Complete change of behaviors is going to be part of that. And for that season of your life, you might just you might be doing maladaptive things,
All right.
but you can't change everything all at once. So when I'm sitting there and I'm going back to school to be, get my MBA and get my CPA and get into the big four, you know, if I sat there and went, I'm going to add a health journey to this too,
Mm-hmm.
that would have been too much.
Right.
And so realizing, like, oh, this is just a part of my life that I have to accept right now, because there is this time sensitive thing that's going through it. And it's the same thing with you get husbands and fathers who come in to the practice and say, well, I want to be more there for my kids. Okay, well, but for right now, for the next 2 years, you might just have to grind.
Right.
And that means you're going to have to give up 2 years to get more high quality years after that. The problem that arises, though, is that it becomes part of people's identities. And when that piece hits, that's the hardest thing to come out. So if I start telling myself, well, Dylan, part of your identity is that you eat Chick-fil-A when you're a stress eater.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to go well. Like, it's not going to go well. But if I say this is something that I acknowledged, I realized what the benefit was, and I used that benefit until I didn't need it anymore, that's a different story, because it's not part of my identity. It's part of my behavior.
That's a great corollary or explanation to how to disassociate the two. In this case, I think detaching, right, is, or putting it in its proper context, maybe is a better way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did you transition from what was I going to say? Shoot, I lost my train of thought there. So, this was during a peak time for you with family, you had mentioned. How did that impact your relationships with your wife, probably most prominently, especially at the beginning? Were you able to have, like you had mentioned, the three topics most married couples avoid that topic? How did you all navigate that road? Um, was it just grin and bear it, and we're just going to have these conversations?
So this is where I wish I could tell you that like I had at the time I had some beautiful revelation of like this is how I'm going to show up and lead here. I did not, and I did it all wrong. So like the way that I did it during that period of time in my life is I think how most people do it. And that is I just started going and I failed to inform everyone around me of what I was doing and why, and with predictable results. So like if you think about for my wife, part of the reason we were even in that position was that we had gone, but we had been living overseas. We came back to the United States, so she can go to grad school. And so she was in graduate school. You know, we have one daughter. She's pregnant with the second one, and I just tell her I quit. I quit my teaching job. You know, so you can imagine she freaks out. I was like, no, it's okay. I got it. Don't worry about it, honey. But I didn't explain what I failed to paint the vision that I had for us and where we were going and what I was doing and why.
Yeah.
And so when we started to have other conversations, what I did is I approached it with her and was like, okay, I created a budget. We got to stick to this budget. You know, I've put $200 in this envelope for you. That's all the money you have. Like, I was a dictator. I was a tyrannical father. And of course, that was a statement of my values at the time, like strict discipline for the next 2.5 years while I do this. But for my wife, what she heard was, you're taking food away from my babies.
Oh,
And now suddenly she's the mama bear
yep.
and I'm the aggressor. We're not on the same team. And with predictable results, there was a lot of fights. There were a lot of unpleasantness. And then over the years, you know, as we continue to progress, what I started to understand was she's not mad at me. She's scared. And that's my fault because I didn't do a good job of laying this out. So then those conversations started to be, you know, sitting down and saying, honey, first off, apologize for the chaos that I caused because that was me. And then to sit and listen to what did she need out of this?
Yeah.
What did she need in this situation? How is this budget going to happen? And it was at that point that I found myself with a great opportunity to learn about my wife. And we had been married for 5 years at that point when we started getting to this place. But then I got to hear about all the shoes story, her equivalent of my shoes story, over and over and over again, of things that happened in her childhood and things that she's scared of and things that are being replayed in our relationship. And my wife became far more three-dimensional. But that required me to have a sense of curiosity, to be able to hold space, to be emotionally regulated myself, and to be able to be intensely interested in now the joint venture that is our marriage. That's hard.
Yeah.
And also, and guys, for the men who are listening, because men do this far more than women, when she's done, when she's hit her emotional limit, that's okay. Let her go. Do not sit there and dig. Because if you keep doing that, they're going to explode because you're putting them in a dangerous situation emotionally. And you're talking about the most emotional thing possible.
That's awesome advice. One, the transparency that, you know, we learn through, unfortunately, at times making the mistakes along the way, but there's a recovery process in that, that allows vulnerability. And it sounds like you all in a great position now to work together. And I like how you position that with, she's got her own story too. You can't be completely siloed in our thinking that, our spouse who is a partner um, don't have their own stories. And you can have some good intention misapplied. Like you said, you were a bit of a dictator. Was that wrong intentions? No. Optimal application? Doesn't sound like it was. And I can relate to that. So no judgment there for sure. Um, but
Well, let me do you one better. Like in a marriage, like when you get married, you go into the courthouse or the church or whatever as two people, and you come out as three. There's you, there's your wife, and now there's this new thing called the marriage
mm-hmm.
with its own wants and needs. So in a money story, Like when I'm working with couples, I always have to, in my head, mentally, leave a chair for the marriage. Because, and this is very true in my marriage, my wife has her own wants and needs, her own stories. I have my own wants and needs and my own stories. And our marriage has its own wants and needs and our own stories. And one of the things in my current, as we're continuing to work and evolve and learn as a couple, is that her and I are on the same page, but the marriage is not yet. And that's kind of hard to look at because the marriage has, 12 years of inertia behind it at this point.
Yeah.
It has 12 years. And of that, half of it was poverty and digging out of poverty. So, we're still working through that as a couple. But I will tell you that as you get your financial house in order, your ability to be more present increases as a function of time, especially for guys. And, it's because they can hear the tick, tick, tick of interest and debt in the back of their head, because
Yeah.
guys are more attuned. Like
You
women
hear
might
that
be more
register
attuned.
ringing.
Yeah, exactly. Like women are more attuned to the negatives and things, but guys are more attuned to the dangers of situations. So they're aware of the money situation and how dangerous it can be. So now think about how you show up as a husband or a father when you don't have your financial house in order and you're constantly stressed out and it's always in the background. Your capacity to do things like hold space for your wife, be intimate with her, allow her own place, her own space to blossom, becomes diminished because your finances aren't in order, and it always at some level.
Yeah. And that produces that stress response, which is that fight or flight. And like you mentioned, the mama bear is going to rise up
Yeah.
because there's that third chair of marriage, which includes, your kids,
Mm-hmm.
any other responsibilities that are, brought together, post the I do. Um, so those are things that you have to account for that really add into that stress uh, and lack of rest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I wear a Fitbit, and
Okay.
I've been tracking my heart rate and stuff like that. And it is crazy. I can always tell when there's something not quite right in my life because my resting heart rate increases. It's I know where it is, I know where it's supposed to be, but I can always be like, oh, what's wrong?
Yeah.
Well, I have data all the way back to that time in my life.
Oh, really?
And I've actually, just because I'm me and I like to play with numbers, I've actually graphed out my resting heart rate versus my net worth, and it decreases as my net worth increases.
Dude,
It's
seriously?
great. Absolutely. Yeah. And like even now, like with holidays, and I have a pretty decent emergency fund. But then when we bought the house, I unfortunately kind of got screwed by my former employer. And so they made a policy change and didn't pay out my sick days. And I was counting on that to replace the emergency fund that I'd used for the down payment on the house. And you can see and everything was fine. Like I had a steady job. I still had plenty of savings in other areas. I had investments. Like nothing was bad, but you can see my heart rate just increase.
Wow.
And then as I made that up, as I put that money back in, you can see it starting to decrease over time. And so like this is a background thing. Your body
Yeah,
keeps the score, man. It knows what's going
100%.
on. And so like how much more present can you be when you are when like your heart rate is low, you're relaxed, your nervous system is chilling out, versus you're always a little bit on edge because you just can't take the same punch you could before.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing example. I'd love to see more data on that. But that's a, a great example of just the corollaries of the things underneath, that iceberg effect that it may be a little bit, but that little bit has that compounding interest negatively over time. And I think that's so cool to see the corollary between that driving up of stress or uh, the mishandling of things versus how your body's responding to that. That is so cool.
Well, and over my journey, because more recently I've been doing a lot more in the emotional space.
Mm-hmm.
As my as my financial situation has changed, I've hit new levels, new devils, and it's important for me to say like, okay, I'm making the same mistakes.
Yeah.
I need to make new mistakes because that shows I'm making progress. So rather than go back to my familiar hell, I must choose the strange heaven. And so part of that is for me has been going to therapy and starting to unpack more and more and more. Um, and it's crazy just like energetically to learn how the body is actually storing things.
Oh yeah.
And you know how it's like, oh my gosh, like, oh, I've got this issue, I've taken on this medication.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not actually a physiological thing, maybe it's a environmental thing, whether it's my money, whether it's working out, whether it's stress with my kids. And my kids of course then pick up on all of that even if they don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And so it's been amazing to me to see how my health actually has improved as I've worked on that emotional component. And of course, the money is tied to that.
Absolutely. And you know, I had a guest say the issues are in the tissues. Actually, two of them mentioned this, and how our body is designed. It's designed amazingly, right? But its sole focus is survival, and sometimes that cuts negatively. Generally, it's pretty good, but it can lock up and provide negative outcomes. It could be, tightness in certain muscles, right? Stress tends to be up in the shoulders. So if you've got a shoulder issue, it may not actually be a rotator cuff issue. It may be that financial stress that you're feeling that's now locking up in your shoulder or however your body responds. You can retain uh, various things like weight or uh, also the inability to move. Like you can have inflammation in the joints. Like it's amazing the corollary between the emotional stress and the inflammation that occurs in your body.
100%. I mean, and like you've met me face to face, I'm not exactly small. And so like the trauma that has been coming through poverty and digging out, you know, all the choices of Chick-fil-A is there for everyone to see.
Mm,
You know, and one of the things the event back in October, I've actually come a long way from the previous year,
really?
you know, in unpacking this and starting to look at this and say, yeah, I really need to dig into this in a much, much deeper level, you
Yeah.
know, and to know that my money story is a part of that. Um, you know, because I'm continuing to build net worth and I'm continuing to budget. My wife and I are putting into, you know, we're testing out a new method that I'm working on that I've seen work with some clients. So we're going to crash test it this year with ourselves.
Cool.
But to understand that, like, oh, the more I'm able to talk to my wife on a business meeting, the more intimate our other conversations have become,
Yeah.
and the more like, and the better I'm sleeping. Like I wear a Fitbit and I can see where my sleeping is, where my sleeping heart rate, how I'm breathing through the night. And I always know like, oh, what happened on that day? Yeah, my wife and I had a disagreement. What happened on that day? Oh, that was the day that I did month-end finances and she was transitioning jobs. So like money was going in different directions. Like we were fine, but there was this disruption in the pay.
Right.
And so it's like that stressed me out and I can see it in the body, even though like mentally I was fine. I'm an
Yeah.
accountant. I do this stuff all day, you know?
But yeah, it's like you said, the body keeps the score. It's amazing. And then that trickle into all the things of health, like in the cascading benefits, of when you get your health in order, it can connect into how you eat, which then affects your health overall and how you move. And then and back and forth, right? And it's all interwoven together. And as you achieve one, it can cascade into those other things.
Yeah, I've told a lot of my clients that like it's impossible to improve one section of your life. Like because everything else will start coming with it.
Yeah.
You know, and going back to my Chick-fil-A example, you know, here I am improving my economic viability as a citizen. I'm improving my financial picture, and now I'm suddenly noticing the food aspect. Until that moment, I had no idea I did that.
Mm,
Right.
yeah.
So now I'm able to work on my food aspect because now I have the money to do so. So I can, you know, buy higher quality ingredients. I've already proven to myself I can do hard things. So now I'm learning to cook better. Right. And so like
Yeah.
the end story of that Chick-fil-A sandwich is now, you know, the Chick-fil-A sandwich is made at home.
Mm,
So, you know, when you look at a budget as a statement of values, my values are spending time with my kids and helping raise them to be self-sufficient. They love Chick-fil-A just as much as I do. And so now we make it at home. So now my girls, they know how to pickle things. They know how to make, you know, bread. We bread the chicken and fry it ourselves. We experiment with things.
Yeah.
And, my oldest is 10, my youngest is 7, and they use knives, like real actual knives. They've been doing it. And so we took what was an expenditure of funds and 15 minutes plus 20 minutes waiting in the drive-through line, right?
Right.
To the same amount of time at a fraction of the cost, creating memories and experiences with my daughter.
Yeah. That's a force multiplier right there, man. I mean, that's
Exactly.
huge.
But it's the ability to choose. It's the ability to live with intentionality that comes out of this. And I
Mhm.
would not have got there if I didn't start getting my financial house in order.
Yeah, because then you see the puts and takes too. Is that full context of what you're doing, and then you can make, like you said, that ability to choose. Um, and if you choose the other route, that's your choice. But at least you're fully aware of what you're choosing. One's choosing to do. Um, so that I love that story. That's a great story of just repositioning and the investment. You can't replace that time with the kids. Plus, they're getting skill. Like you said, they know how to pickle. They know how to use knives. I mean, those are skills that will translate into other aspects of life. Speaking of, we're getting close on time. What are some skills, maybe two, three, four, whatever that is, where folks take that first couple steps? What are the things to focus on to get down this path similar to yours?
Step 1, breathe. Take a deep breath, man. Like, it's going to be okay. And understand that when you start looking at your emotions or start looking at your money, you're going to be looking at your emotions. You might be looking at it and saying, well, I have a spending problem, but you might actually have an income problem.
Hmm.
And the process, you have to breathe your way through that so that you can feel okay to get to the next step, which is to love yourself enough to do something about it because you are worthy of it. And those might seem like weird steps on a money story, but they're critical ones. To breathe and love yourself enough to do something about it. If you have a spending issue, let's love ourselves enough to rewrite the stories that serve ourselves. If you have an income problem, let's love ourselves enough to make the investment in the best investment you can ever make, which is yourself, to move forward. And then number 3, make a plan, even if it's a small one. And understand that that plan will make a lot more sense once you get in motion. Just like a GPS unit in your car, it doesn't start telling you which way to go until you get in motion. So make a small plan, a small step. I'm going to take one class. I'm going to save one thing. I'm going to make one meal at home. And prove to yourself that you can do it. And then the last step is sit down and ask yourself, where do you want to be in 5 years? So you know where those steps are supposed to lead. And if you ever find yourself getting worried or upset or scared, go back to step 1 and breathe.
Awesome, man. I think that's a great way to button this up. I really appreciate your perspective, the correlations, and just the practicality of it all to help reframe how to leverage the resources that we do have. It doesn't matter how many numbers to the left of the comma you have, but there's a way to get there and to do it in a healthy way, and the impact it can have exponentially when you get that house of order. Um, I like to close things out with a couple personal questions, kind of a hot seat, not too heavy. But
100%. I'm
what?
here for it.
All right, ready? What are you reading right now?
I'm reading Money, the True Story of a Made-Up Thing by Jacob Goldstein.
Interesting.
It is a great book, and on my podcast, I did an entire series on money and what money is and why it is a shared fiction. And then somebody was like, "Hey, you got to read this book," and I got to tell you, it is a really good book. I like it a lot.
I am picking that one up. All right. So, what are you listening to right now? Music, be it music or podcast.
What I'm listening to right now is I'm listening to a lot of instrumental house music because at work I've got a huge investigation that we're buttoning up, and that I can just put on the beats and I can just sink into it, and it makes the whole world disappear, so I can focus.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, you found
My
the type of music that kind of gets you zoned in.
So I have different playlists for different activities. So if I'm doing a lot of data work, it's a lot of trance house. If I'm doing a lot of writing, it's instrumental house. If I'm doing contract readings, it's Gregorian chant. It's got to be no words, and it's got to be a consistent a consistent direction with the music. Like ups and downs are really bad.
Yeah.
I want to lock in, and it helps me focus.
Cool. What is that on? What, Spotify or?
Spotify, and there's a couple of podcasts that do like hour-long sets.
Oh, really?
Groove Electric is one of them by Steve Boyette. Man, that man has carried me through so much in my life.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. And last one, what's your go-to rest and recovery method?
My go-to rest and recovery method is rucking at night.
Interesting. Okay.
When I need to regulate myself, I'll put 30 pounds in my rucksack, and I will go after dark when it's cold without headphones. And the cold clears my head. The quiet of the neighborhood is just, it is a theory. I can hear the coyotes. I can hear the owl. We have an owl that lives in the neighborhood. And by the time I get home, whatever stresses I walked out the door with they're either not there anymore, or I have a shooting solution as the next step to do.
Cool. I love that. That's awesome. Dylan, brother, thank you so much for your time, your insights, your expertise in what you're doing with your podcast and your coaching. I think it's a critical skill that I and many other people, I'm sure, could use that help and assistance to reframe our financial narrative. So thank you, brother. How can people find you?
So you can find me on anywhere you find podcasts. The podcast name is Fiscally Savage. You can go to my website, fiscallysavage.com, or you can find me at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Fiscally Savage. I am most active on Instagram. So if you got a question, comment, concern, or worry, and you'd like to directly contact me, that's how you can do it.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
My pleasure.